Hey, Quicksters, welcome to Quick Take. So glad that you're here. I'm Susie along with James. So, James,
Susie,
what are we talking about today?
I've been having some very fun conversations with some groups I'm working with around the challenges of culture and influence and motivation and really just general culture issues. And as we have spent a lot of time early on in these conversations around how you get the individual contributor to do certain things, or how do we deal with the executive team and what is their messaging? But we really started to talk about a topic that I think is really undersung, which is really how do we put the energy on that middle management, how that middle layer that I think is underappreciated, under discussed, and really such a critical element to the business. I think it'd be fun to discuss how do we as leaders take a breath and look at that middle layer and work hard to take advantage of the skills and the resources that they actually are.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum, that middle layer, because you're not new, so you're not being paid attention to, and your mistakes aren't something that are just general, but you're not at the decision maker always at that level. So you kind of feel like you're a person on stage without a microphone, if you will. It's hard to stand out. And I think another thing as a part of this conversation that I think is interesting is we always think that corporate politics or workplace politics is a one and done, like one sentence for a company, but it's different at every level of the same organization. And so if you don't have the optics to understand the struggles and the challenges of that mid-level, you might be adding fuel to the fire of some negative game playing that's going on. If you don't, like you say, take a step back and look at the organization from a different lens.
That's exactly right. Where that different lens that group has, I think, is so unique. I did some research. That layer has a very unique tenure. You tend to have very short tenure at the top and very short tenure at the bottom as executives move off quickly or come in and rotate out. Early individual contributors may leave companies, but that middle layer has the longest tenure too. And so just the reality that group has a different persona, I think, is worth really evaluating.
Yeah. And we assume that their path, it's interesting that they've been with the company for the longest amount of time. I was with a group of individual contributors last week that have huge impact within the organization. And I always talk about having a view of what you want to do next so that you can move yourself toward that. But one guy raised his hand and he goes, but what if I'm really happy with where I am? Isn't that okay too? And so really thinking about the needs, just because we believe that there's this hierarchy of where everybody's trying to go, it's not true everywhere. So taking a step back and listening to understand.
Yeah, I read a great related article about Pepsi that they acknowledged this in the early 2000s, and they created a concept called mid-level managers as change accelerators. They knew that if they could get that group engaged, that it actually moved the needle much faster than involving other groups, because they were the longest tenured. They did understand the business the most, and they could affect change at the largest areas. And so they put a program around middle management, and they saw some significant improvements in performance.
And I want to add to what you're saying too, is they also have deep rooted relationships, and they have trust, and they kind of know where the bodies are buried. That's an old term, but they also know who gets things done so they can rally the team together. And so I think that's a piece of it, is how do you take those already embedded networks of how things get done, and how do you add some accelerant to it?
We as leaders need to take an active approach towards that middle management layer and putting structures around it, stick processes around it, create a situation where they can be empowered to be more effective. And I think, if you can come up with tactics or processes, just things that really highlight that middle management, you can go a long way.
Yeah. It's also understanding what it will really motivate them to pull people together. So how do you do that? Let's talk a little bit about what does that look like? What are kind of the tactics or strategies around being that observer on what's going on in the middle?
There's a group of friends that I spend time with, a C-suite of executives, and we tend to brag about not our accomplishments at the negotiating table, at the compensation table, but it's really more about the number of CTOs that we have made. How many of our leaders have we promoted and grown into that role? And I think how you can do that at a leadership level here and talking about that middle management is stop focusing on output and start focusing on people. Start focusing on ways that you can develop those people and really the way that they grow within the middle management. Because I think that if you can start focusing on elevating those middle management needs, you can surface those to the top, bring their ideas up to the top, you're going to grow that team in a way that you've never seen before. And so taking action to do that, I think, can really move the needle.
That makes me think of a client of mine who told me that she has younger people that work on her teams and she's getting them ready so that they can be her boss. And she really envisions that. Like she's like, I'm excited to work for them. And I think that's a great mindset because we talk about it, but if you could really embody that spirit around that, that will translate.
It's entirely possible that those people that I'm working with that work for me now, that I could work for them in the future, and that'd be cool. I'm fine with that. I have no ego in that game. The worst case scenario is, honestly, I end up working for one of my former employees and they treat me like crap. I feel like that's on me. I've reaped what I have sown. I love that approach to think about how you should be growing your teams to be your future leaders.
Yeah, because you never know what it's going to be like in the future. And if you can really embrace that and see that as an opportunity, just because the hierarchy doesn't mean smarter at the top, there's so much perspective all along the way that we can really tap into. And that goes to what you were saying about collaboration and motivation. As we've talked about too, that you got to make sure that that team feels motivated because they're the core of
You've
your
got
business.
to help them have the tools to survive that pressure. Let's remember too, they're in the middle. They're feeling pressure from upper management to perform and to behave in a certain way, to grow. They're feeling pressure from below on how are you going to help me grow my career? How are you going to help me get to where I want to be? And so you need to give them tools to manage that pressure. Understand that escalation is not failure. Asking for help is a way of showing growth. Really giving those teams, those individuals, the agency to understand the role that they're in. And there are ways for them to get better that don't necessarily look like them having to have all the answers.
I just did a 360. I do 360s with senior leaders teams. And one of the things that the team's feedback that they articulated to me was, we have so much going on. We have so many priorities. And sometimes our regular meetings get overrun by all the things that are coming up. And so our leader will go off the agenda. And then we leave the meeting feeling more overwhelmed than when we left. And so I told that leader, all you have to do is at the end of the meeting, just make sure that you reset. Here are our priorities. And I say that because I think we try to solve all the problems as leaders. Let them solve the problems. Just give them some framework to feel confident, courageous, and empowered to move the business forward.
And I love the way you articulated that, is really helping people understand their boundaries and be confident and say, look, that's outside my wheelhouse, or that is not within the remit of my role. And having the confidence to do that, having the agency to do that. You have a meeting where it's all over the map. The leader should be comfortable saying, just to be clear, that is a problem here. However, that's not something I control or we control. We're all on the same page here, right? That's not something we can fix. So I love the idea of helping middle managers understand their boundaries.
And guess what that does? When you model that, you're teaching them to model that. And that's what leadership is about. It's not, here, this is how you lead. Here's the book you have to read, or this is what you need to do. Some of that is the feel that you give to people and the confidence that you give them. And that comes from modeling. So if you do this and pay attention to them, they'll pay attention to the right people in their teams.
One of the quotes I love was, middle managers are not in the middle because they're stuck. They're in the middle because they connect. And if you can think about that differently and understanding that they're the ones that make that happen, and if you can connect that team to the vision, you can connect that team to leadership and to the influence that they have, that's real leadership. That's how you make that middle management work for you.
I think
Perfect.
That was a great way to sum it up. That was power. Thanks, James.